populations. And the one that came to mind immediately for me, that's a fundamental one, is the whole global population issue. We've all been hearing most of our lives how the population is growing and it's causing great problems, and virtually all of the problems of the planet could be handled if the population were dealt with, and so on. And when I was studying, population genetics and those kinds of things, the idea of zero population growth was very popular, and people were trying to find out ways to make that happen, and so on. So I thought we would talk about what's actually happening. And this is what the current projections through 2050 look like. I'd like to point out that it's not a steep curve. It's begun to shallow out a little bit. When we were growing up, it was a much steeper curve than this. So the other piece of it is those are age groups. So the bottom line of 15 and younger is not increasing hardly at all, which means the future is not going to increase all that much, yes? And the middle group is rounding out faster while the older group continues to expand, because we know how to live longer in the kind of world that we're living in. So we're looking at, in 2030, having about 8 point whatever, and then by 2050 having 9.8 billion. And then the idea is by 2100, on that projection, we would have about 11.25 billion people on the planet. Half again, a little more than half again of what we have now. So that would mean we would, those of you who remember Portland, for example, 40 years ago, we'll see more cities like that, cities that are like 500,000 become 2 million. And that's another piece of it. A lot of people are moving into the cities. We'll see a lot more suburbanification, we used to call it Californication, of the world. So here's those numbers again, a little more precisely. And the expectation by the UN as of 2017 is 83 million people a year added to the world's population. And interestingly, they're expecting 9 countries to provide most of that growth, including the USA, which is another interesting piece. Notice that those are all, except for the USA, developing countries.
China's not there.
No. China, their policy has paid off. They are not contributing a lot to world growth. So the expectation is that 1.75 children per household is what's needed to maintain a population. And if you're below that, the US was at 1.1, but we're back up over 2 again. So this is where, another way to look at it, the lowest population growth are the blue, and the highest are the purple, and the red are pretty high up in there. And of course, it's in the least urbanized areas that we see the most development in population. There's lots of different imaging of all of that. And this is another way to look at it. Europe's going down. They're the most urbanized, educated, industrialized region in the world, and their population goes down over the period, the next 30 to 50 years. And then North America and Asia, remember most of Asia was blue. These are relatively low growth rates, so we will have relatively small population increase. But Africa has the most, that area that was all those bright colors. So that's the United Nations projection for world population. So I remember back in the 1970s, Jean-Jacques Cousteau and a few other people were doing things. How would it be to live on a planet with 12 billion people? And under these projections, by the end of this century, that's what we've got, is shortly, just about 12 billion people. It is doable with proper planning, but the US is not doing that planning, and many other countries are not as well. So there are countries that are doing it, and China is one of them. Right now, I'm told they have close to 50 million empty households, but that's because they expect that to grow very quickly, right? Because they're one of the major, you know, if the planet is 7 billion, they are 1.1 billion of the planet. So 50 million people happens pretty quickly for them. So they're building ahead is what they're doing.
But China has a problem because of the way they implemented it. They removed all the girls, and then when the boys grew up, there were no mates.
Yes, and that's another piece of what China's going to be facing here coming up. So we'll you know, each country, each region has its own issues to deal with. Africa has its issues to deal with, everyone.
Although creating that imbalance does make the population
Birth rate goes down.
maintain
One of the things, the reason that Europe is having a decrease in population is that they are marrying later and later. They are like, you know, late 20s, early 30s, and we're starting to see that here in the US and Canada. We're seeing many people, you know, in their mid-20s who not even on the radar that they're going to get married, and or even live together, and you know, in that kind of conjugal way. The other thing that we're seeing is an increase in LGBTQ and a lot of other alternatives that were not acceptable 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So the US has very clear policies. This is what the Department of State publishes, which I think is an interesting place to have it. It's not in Health and Human Services.
Does not endorse.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. In any way. And this has been America's policies for quite a while, but particularly under the current administration. They're very visible with it in the current administration. And it, you know, in some ways, it fits our laissez-faire attitudes. So, this is what the conspiracy popular country, popular American internet suggests is going on in the world to help turn around the population explosion. They are believing, and they can support to some extent, that these things are being encouraged so that the population will be decreased. And they're actually, there is a whole body of theory and a lot of stories and anecdotal evidence suggesting that there is somehow some group of folks who have control a lot of wealth who want the population of the earth to be cut by about 90%, so that we're operating at 10% and everyone is being a transhuman, that method 1 down there, merging humans with sophisticated technologies that greatly enhance our capacities. Okay, basically cyber people. And I have no idea whether there's any basis in all of that, but I can understand through our popular media why they would think that. And it's out there. There are a lot of people who promote any or all of the above as intentional on some people's part to reduce the world population.
There was a series called Humans. And it was intriguing. That looked at a lot of the problems and issues of that transhumanism. But people are really thinking about that.
Oh yeah, yeah. Have been as long as I've been reading science fiction. That's all my life. So.
And many of these things are contributing factors, and yet, you know, when you take it to an extreme, it's really the malicious intent part that takes it down the wrong road. Looking at these are natural environmental factors that are.
They are things that are happening.
That naturally curb the population growth, and so the only thing really wrong with it is that thought that it's intentionally malicious, other than the transhuman one, because that's actually working against us. As you were saying, the older people, the older generation are living longer, and it's because that's already taking place. You know, so many people in this day and age do have
some part of them no longer. Yes.
But I don't understand this.
Okay.
What does food supply mean?
That they are saying that the food supply is being manipulated to make it make either people sterile or, you know, unlikely to create other beings.
Oh.
Okay,
And what's the GMOs?
GMO is
Oh, that's the
one of the ways. It's
Yeah.
part of the food, but it's also other things. Genetically modified organisms are present in a lot of other ways than food supply. Like trees. Like certain algae are being developed to do things. Bacteria being introduced in various ways that may or may not ultimately be good for us.
I see.
But again, on that.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you
To
here.
point out the positives of these, when we were in Ireland, we were at the museum and they had this display of worms that were eating styrofoam.
Yep.
So GMOs are being used in beneficial ways as well.
Yeah, I said may or may not.
I'm
Yeah,
just
we
trying to
know in the
that.
short term, they may be quite good. In the long term, we don't know. And that's the one piece that those of us who do long-term future studies get really concerned about. We have gotten out of the habit of doing long-term studies before we release things. We've gotten out of the habit of asking what are the impacts and implications, not just the immediate ones, but the secondary ones and the tertiary ones. And yeah, very few people are doing that in the world
Okay,
today.
well, one more random comment. If you say out of the habit, that implies we were actually in the habit. So
We were, from 1969 to 1989, it was built into almost everything we did. Yeah, and that's when I was doing it as a professional. All right, so what's interesting is there is a little overlap between what the more, quote, positive folks, this is the positive.news site, have been saying are possible solutions. So empowering women, there's a lot of, not just study, but there's a lot of history that suggests that women who are not alone, isolated on a farm, are more likely to be able to control, their first choice usually is to control their bodies and to reduce the number of children, almost invariably. Promoting family planning, a lot of women have never been taught, and certainly men have never been taught, that you can have something to say about whether a baby's going to be born or not, right? And, I like this one, make education entertaining. Get people interested in learning more about things. Government incentives, there are all kinds of government incentives out there, share different tax rates, up to 4 children, you get to deduct them, beyond 4 you don't, those kinds of things. But also for people who are on government subsidies, up to a point you get the subsidy but you don't get beyond it, etc. And then what happened in China, the one-child legislation and all that meant. So those are some of the things they're suggesting as possible solutions to reduce what was once called the population bomb. Now what's actually happening worldwide overlaps all of this. People are being given access to contraception all over the world. The baby boom is interesting. The official ending of the baby boom, post-World War II baby boom, is also the first year contraceptives were made available to American women. Isn't that interesting?
What year was that?
1962.
Oh, 62.
Yeah. Now, in my world, that's much too late to be a baby boomer. I know people who are born between 60 and 62 who do not have that sense of how the world could have been and isn't that a baby boomer has. So my definition of a baby boomer, you do not remember VJ Day, but you know precisely where you were when you learned Kennedy was assassinated. John Kennedy, not Robert. And that's huge. Because Camelot and the world was going to be perfect, and progress is our most important product, and all of that, and it was pre-Sesame Street. And so it's a whole different experience from the kids who were born in the 60s, just for what that's worth. Okay, encouragement for abstinence, that's relatively new in American culture. It's consistent with other cultures. Don't even try. Don't run the risk. Stay out of that way. And what's interesting is we're seeing just in the last couple of years in the US, kids are abstaining. There's fewer and fewer teen pregnancies, there's fewer and fewer teen purchases of contraceptions, fewer and fewer abortions. They're waiting till their 20s. They are waiting for their 20s. So it's like the baby boomers did something that was totally off the wall, and now we're all done with that. Now we can go back to life as it was originally laid out, or in our culture laid out.
I think there was more open discussion about STDs and what can happen. We're going rampant in my generation.
Right, because we had no idea they even existed, most of the baby boomers. And then when we did, it was, okay, what can we do to avoid it? Not, oh, we don't even have to go there, right? But there's another piece, I think, too, and that is that the baby boomer generations were raised often on Dr. Spock, who was trying to do the best he could, but a lot of us were really hungry for affection, touch, and nourishment and appreciation, and sex was one way to get it. And later generations have not had that. They've had other things, but not that. All right, so here's another approach that is happening worldwide. Infant mortality is going down. Literally, it's about half of what it was even in the 70s and 80s. And except in the US, we're going up. But everywhere else, it's going down. And what that's doing is encouraging people to have fewer babies. My kids aren't dying at 6 months, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years. So there are fewer children being born. And then access to sterilization. That's a terrible word, but how many women do you know have had a hysterectomy or had their tubes tied, or how many guys have had vasectomies? That's what that is, right? And a lot of girls in their 20s, I'm being told by an OBGYN nurse, are getting everything taken out. They don't even want to have to think about it. They don't know the long-term consequences of that, back to what I said earlier. But they're just saying, I don't even want to have to think about ever having babies. And I don't want to have a period, and I don't want to have a menstrual cramps, and I don't want to have all of that stuff.
But they have to do hormones.
Yeah, yep. And they don't, like I said, they're not really clear on the long-term consequences.
It's like perpetual menopause.
It can be. Yeah, it can be. But that access to it has gone up worldwide. It's easier to get those things done without as much of a hassle as it was. Access to abortion, not so much. It hasn't gone up that much, but it has been legal for a couple of decades, a few decades, and that's made a difference. Illegal abortion is something that's terrifying in almost every culture where it is illegal. And then ultimately changing the status of women. When we are not feeling like we have to stay barefoot in the kitchen and pregnant, we're more likely to not stay barefoot in the kitchen and pregnant.
The thing on infant mortality is such a difficult issue. I was faced with that. I was doing some fundraising for a clinic in Tibet, and because I raised that money, they could have these birthing kits, and they could have refrigerators to store medicines, and so they were losing most of their children. A very small population was living past the age of 5. But given these refrigerators and these birthing kits, these children were going to grow up, and I was like, what are we going to do? They're living up in the tundra, and because your shoe, it's way up there, half of the population. So, it's like, when I think about the mother losing her child, I want to help, but when I think about the earth supporting a population that has growth, because it just maintains itself, that will have growth now, it feels like it's immoral. I didn't know how to deal with that question.
Well, generally, the point here is that generally when infant mortality goes down, people stop choosing to have the babies. Okay, so where they would have had 7 or 8 children, or 9 or 10, in the hopes that 2 or 3 would actually make it through adolescence. And that was accurate for a lot of people for a long time. Now they may have 3 or 4, and then realize, oh my goodness, I don't even have to do that. I can have 2 or 3 kids, and that's what's going to happen. Another thing that none of the studies that I looked at addressed is my own experience, blended families. Okay, in my circle, in my immediate blended family circle, there are 3 adult women and 4 men, and between us, we had 5 girls and 1 boy. 7 of us only bore 6 kids. That's kind of interesting. And in my daughter's blended family situation, there is 2 men, 3 women, and there are 3 girls and 1 boy. And that's all that's happening. So, that's another piece. The blended family tends to affect birth rates. So I'm curious to see how that unfolds. And I haven't seen that in any of the research. Hmm?
You enter with a pile of kids, you don't have a lot of motivation to get more.
Exactly, right, yeah. When there are already, when you already have a family, you have 1 more just because it's ours.
Yeah.
And generally that's it. The next thing that is actually happening is there is family planning education going on everywhere, including in the Catholic Church. There is only 1 Christian sect that says it's not okay to plan your family. And that's the Duggars. The Duggars on TV, they're from 13 and counting, 19 and counting. Their sect says it's not okay not to get pregnant. Because God gave you that as a blessing. But I haven't been able to find any other Christian sect that doesn't say family planning is okay. Now, they have different techniques, and some of them are more consistently effective than others. But nonetheless, that's
Even Catholics?
yeah. Catholics have been teaching family planning for at least 50 years that I know.
Protestants?
No, it's the rhythm method, and it's based on the woman's cycle. And they actually encourage sexual play during certain times rather than actual intercourse, which is a big shift from even 50, 80 or 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So immigration, a lot of countries are reducing, and this is part of what's going on here, are trying to reduce their population growth by reducing immigration, which I think is fascinating. Other countries are saying, and Canada is one, is saying our birth rate is so low we can't come up with more laborers, so we will use a meritocratic approach to bring in only high-functioning people, but we will encourage immigration and we will encourage cultural plurality, unlike the American melting pot. So Canadians are moving towards cultural plurality and more immigration to replace their birth rate.
What's that, plurality?
Salad bowl, not melting pot.
Oh, okay.
All right, and then the idea of having tax rates is happening in some countries, and the 1 and 2 child policies is happening in China and 1 or 2 other countries. And then a lot of them are actually saying, go marry someone and go there. You want to have kids, go somewhere else.
That's a real planetary word.
So we are seeing a lot of activity attempting to reverse what was called the population bomb back in the 70s. And 0 population growth is therefore possibly becoming a reality. Now this is one of the things that's happening. I showed it up differently on the other graph. The green is us and the tan is the rest of the world. Fewer and fewer people under 15 and more over 65. Very few people over 65 are going to bear children. So as the bulk of the population is made up of more and more people in that age group, we're going to see fewer and fewer births per person, births per capita, right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So I didn't put it together, but a normal population curve, if we did a bell-shaped curve, it would be skewed in the 15 to 25 range, and down to almost 0 at 0, and getting down to 0 at 60 plus. So it would be a big hump in that 15 to 25 age range, and over there. This is getting more and more like a camel. You got some here and some there. So with fewer in the middle and fewer in the ends. That's going to be an interesting world. The other piece that's happening, and this has been demonstrated over and over and over again, if you put a family in the city, they stop having kids. Because in the city, a kid is a drain. On the farm, a kid is a helper. And so as of 2012, we were over 50% in the city, and we're headed toward 2/3 of the world's population being in an urban environment. Now, some other things happen. Not only is a child a drain, but in an urban environment, as opposed to isolated on the farm, the woman is more likely to be working with other women and having peer group relationships instead of auntie relationships. So where the aunties say, go get married and have kids, the peer are going, are you really thinking about that? Yeah, are you sure you want to do that? Right, so that's one of the things. Access to education, access to information, all increases in urbanization as well. So,
And other things to do.
and lots of other things.
And it's also very difficult, I mean, not just a drain, having children in an urban environment. There are no infrastructure for having children and being able to deal with them in that environment, where in a rural environment, you don't need it as much.
Right, yeah, it's true. So, all of the things that I've been pointing out is leading one set of researchers to suggest, guess what? It isn't exploding anymore. In fact, it's going to go downhill. They're saying that we're going to be seeing birth rates of less than 1.75 in all of these situations, in the industrialized nations, wherever there are urban centers, where delayed marriage is happening and where there is LGBTQ stuff going on. And they're saying there will be a slight increase in death rates as with the aging population. And we'll start to see new and returning endemics and warfare. And all of that will be leading to a reverse in population growth. Now this is two guys, Daryl Brooker and John Ibbotson. This book just came out. It was funny.
What are they basing the new and returning endemics about?
Have you heard that 900 people died of the measles in Madagascar last month?
And smallpox.
And yeah, smallpox is coming back, TB is coming back. There is a resistant strain of TB. Yeah, they're coming back. So they're projecting this kind of structure, not just in a slowing down, but an actual decrease, so that by 2100 we're slightly less than now. And they're saying they can't see, using any of the current trends, any reason for that decreasing number to not continue. They're expecting the population to continue to go down. I'd never buy any projections that say nothing's going to change. But based on what they are seeing, they're offering that. And I'm going to let them talk. You okay with that?
Yeah.
Let me ask you first, maybe Daryl, since you're notably the numbers guy. What is it that we
Let me give you
about global population? Underestimate or overlook or don't give weight to?
It's a really restricted model, and they've been using it for many years.
The UN.
It's a model that only has 3 variables in it. Fertility, mobility, so people moving around, and mortality. So anything that relates to culture or cultural change, not in it. And what we discovered as we went around the world and we talked to people about this and we looked at the statistics from other demographers outside, is that there's an awful lot else going on other than these 3 things.
So what else is going on?
Well, you could sum all of this into a word, actually, urbanization. Last decade, for the first time in history, we grew the species in most of the cities. We're now 55% of the cities. And 4 big things happen when people move from the countryside to the city. First, children go from being an asset, parent feelings, to a liability, just enough to feed. The second thing that happens is women become educated. They have access to schools that they didn't have when they were in the country. They have access to media that they didn't have when they were in the country. They have access to other women as well. And as women become more educated in urban environments, they begin to demand some control over their lives. And that includes having some control over their bodies. And when women have some control over their bodies, they invariably choose to have fewer children. Also, the power of religion,
Invariably.
which almost always says you should get married, settle down, and have lots of kids, no matter who your God happens to be, is much stronger in rural environments than it is in urban environments. So that pressure weakens. And then finally, the power of clan. When you're in a village, say, your extended family, all those aunties telling you that you should get married and settle down, they lose power, and instead their co-workers, for example, become important peer groups. And when was the last time one of your co-workers urged you to have a baby? So urbanization does all of those things, and as a result, once a society begins to urbanize, its birth rate begins to fall. It can fall slowly over a century and a half, as it did in the West, as we urbanized slowly, or it can happen in a single generation, as it's happening now in the developing world.
But what about the areas of the world where perhaps that may not be as obvious, like Africa, for example?
Well, that was one of the revelations in the book, and it was a revelation to John and I when we were doing the research, is that the trends that he was talking about, that most people apply to the developed world, actually apply to the developing world as well. So when you go into the book and you travel with us to, a favela in Brazil, or you travel to a slum in Nairobi or a slum in Delhi, and you hear women who we interviewed actually saying the same sorts of things that John just talked about, you realize that this is happening all over the world.
And there's data as well there. For example, we were in Kenya, which is an important South African country, where the fertility rate is plummeting, and where girls now graduate equally with boys at primary school level, and in the graduation exams, on average, do better than the boys. So once again, the correlation, Sub-Saharan Africa is urbanizing. As it urbanizes, girls are getting an education. As they get an education, they choose to have fewer children, fertility rates decline.
But what the UN is missing, you argue, I assume, is the pace of change. The United Nations numbers must see that same trend in some fashion.
No, it's a regressive model. So what happens in the modeling is they look at what happened in the past. So it's really a function of what has happened in countries that are similar over time periods of the past, as opposed to what's going on in the future. So they try to project from what they know, as opposed to actually what's happening in those countries right now, based on the previous modeling and based on old information. And one of the issues that we're dealing with is that this change is accelerating far faster than the models are capable of capturing.
Technology must be a piece of this, and I can't remember which one of you I read sort of had an aha moment with some women.
That was in the slum in New Delhi. You were there, I'll tell the story. So Daryl went, what was the name?
Oh, I can't even remember. It's in the book.
Many, many syllables, it starts with an S.
Okay.
Interviewing mostly young women in one of the largest slums in New Delhi. And they talked about how much they disliked, how unhappy they were with the men in their lives. This, by the way, was a universal constant around the world. And how they didn't want to live the lives that their mother lived. But they were under tremendous pressure, societal pressure, family pressure, and pressure from the men in their lives to have kids, especially boys. So there was this tension, and we wondered, resolving that tension could have a lot to say about the future of the race. And as these women were talking, we kept looking beneath their saris like this, and finally one of them pulled out a smartphone. They all had smartphones. They all had access to some of human knowledge. And by the way, the latest study that just came out on fertility rates in the Lancet in November is India now at 2.1. 2.1 is the replacement rate, the number of children women must have in society to keep the population stable. India is now a stable population rate, and in fact, like all other societies, it won't stay at 2.1, it will fall.
And the UN has them at 2.4.
And there you have it. So this is a Canadian broadcast. These are Canadian authors within a Canadian interviewer. The show's called In Context. And I was delighted to see that. This book that they've done is saying, watch out, folks. Our economy is based on growth, not on shrinking populations. Our world economy, the globalized economy, is about to be thoroughly disrupted. In the same way that the U.S. has been. We are tearing buildings down in order to have new construction. We are doing all kinds of things in order to have our economic indicators look like we continue to grow. And that started to change in the 80s. It was Ronald Reagan's administration that changed the indicators.
That's crazy, tearing down old buildings for new ones. our dams are a disaster, our bridges are a disaster. These things that were all built by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his New Deal, the roads across the country, they're all gotten to a certain age where they have to all be replaced.
Yep.
And the
Yep.
money's not going there. I have a friend who's in charge of dams in Colorado, and he was always lamenting that he wasn't getting any money, and people were just turning a blind eye.
Right, so we have, you know, a misunderstanding of appropriate use of funds, along with a model of what is healthy that isn't showing up adequate, you know, and then we have a model of what's happening in the world that isn't accurate. And you put all that together and it gets very confusing very quickly. So,
Just seems like that breaks down to that a reprioritization is required, taking all of this into account.
it is, and this is the work that I'm doing. This is why I wrote my books about, you know, a different way of living on the planet. Currently, there's Creating a New World, but the new edition is called Home. We can have the future that we want. Yeah, so, you know, the issues with the reduction in population are going to really require that we think very differently. And what I keep finding over and over again is the solution is small communities that are essentially self-reliant, rather than large urban centers that are tied into a global network of urban centers. The urbanization, the whole US is considered urbanized. It doesn't matter whether you live 50 miles from nowhere or live in the middle of New York City, you're considered urbanized because you have access to everything an urban center has. You have power, you have, you know, telephone, you have public schools, you have public libraries, you have all these things, more or less, right? And so the assumption is that all of America is urbanized, but Canada and the US. That is not quite true, but by and large, most of us are, and we do have these things. So if we can make sure we have the positives of an urban setting and be able to have it be a place where people are supporting each other in their well-being, then we have a possibility of moving forward through all of this. So the issue was the global population increase. It looked like it was an exponential issue. It's already slowed down and may be beginning to turn around. The solution, these two factors more than any single thing, educate the women so they're empowered, and gives them access to the good things of an urban culture. The time frame for us to begin to feel the effect is less than 40 years. We will see it before our grandchildren, our grandparents. And that's pretty impressive because, you know, we're accustomed to these things taking hundreds of years, not decades. This is the whole world population is turning around. So what I would like to do now is have more dialogue and see, you know, if there's more that we want to have said before we go on with the next piece of this program.
Well, since the 80s, we've moved into the Aquarian age, and an age is an underlying platform. And going back to the 40s, it was a cancer generation. So those people were really into family, and they were really into children, and it was a very fertile energy.
Mm-hmm.
And our generation was into Leo, which was more of like just play around. And children kind of come from just play around, goal was playing around. But now we've moved through several energies that are not that fertile.
Mm-hmm.
And Aquarius per se is not. It's more into friendships, it's more into cooperation, the values of this whole ethic. And right now, Carl Jung said it takes 500 years to get into the age, but Aquarius is also much faster. Uranus is ruled by Uranus, it's much faster, so it won't take 500 years, but we are moving into a time that has no awareness of boundaries, separating boundaries of countries. So there's a lot more of people coming together in different ways, and everything's going to be accelerated now. And also being gay is a part of it, because the Aquarian energy is more bisexual.
It's, or androgynous.
Or
yeah.
androgynous.
Yeah.
And so it's the energies itself, the global energies themselves, will move everyone to less and less of what used to be the ethics.
All right. So if we look at that, you're drawing on both astrology and the archetypal understandings of that in helping us see that. But if we go to, say, the Mayan understanding of what's going on, they were seeing that what had been was a world based on material understanding, material counting of wealth, material technologies, where matter was what mattered. And that as that age came to an end, which we are near the end of that process, where the sun is being affected, according to them, the center of the galaxy is where we are being affected as we make this change. And for them, I think it's about a 30-year process. On the other side of that, it's a spiritual-based technology and a spiritual-based culture rather than a material-based technology and culture. So they're saying kind of a similar thing in that. And if we look at the Hindu notion of the shifting of the ages, we are in the middle of one of those too. And we're shifting from one that was based on the powerful, angry mother and to one that is based on an abstraction. Not even an image, but an archetypal abstraction. And so that's something to be aware of. So yes, there is a shift happening that we can talk about in terms of human development, we can talk in terms of planetary cycles, we can talk in terms of all kinds of things, but there is this shift happening, and so turning around the growth in the population makes sense in that context. Yeah.
And in the Kali Yuga, which is coming to closure,
Right.
that was when humanity would be the furthest from God.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, as we leave this era and go into the other one, more into the spirituality, seeing each other from a spiritual perspective. And, I've just come through a few experiences where Foofs and the people in Foof really help each other in such a way. And I helped Jay, and I went to the bank with him, and I had to explain something to these people, and they were like, "You're not family. Why are you helping him?" And I go, "Because I belong to a church and we do that." Right? And he goes, and the man's looking at me. He's looking at me like he's trying to put me in a box and make sense out of me. And it was like, but in having to explain to him, I articulated to myself, and that is that the people in this room are trying to live the principles we do want to see in the world. Not try, that are living those principles. And when we've been going through this thing about Foof growing now, and what that would mean, it came to me that as we grow and as we take on more population, there are more people saying, yes, I want to be part of this kind of behavior. And then they start doing stuff out in the community. That there's more of us doing stuff out in the community. That it's just, this is how we spread the ethic of being this kind of community. And back to the farmer's wife with all her children, that was her circle.
Yeah.
That was her primary circle. And the more the family is, the more you had your circle. But as we create this Foof consciousness, let's say, of people being family, you don't need the children.
That actually brings up something. I've lived in the inner city most of my life, and at one point, the 3 households took down all our fences, and we shared a lot of resources. And the guy on the end had the vegetable garden, he had the most sun, and the household in the middle had the most kids, and we turned that into the playground. And then our end was kind of the quiet corner. We had the orchard, we had the plum and the walnut and the cherry and the grapes and all of that. And so the adults kind of hung out in that space. And we shared vehicles, we shared computers, we shared all kinds of things. It was a wonderful experience. The family in the middle was a younger couple than either end, and they went for baby number 8 while we were all doing this, because the younger mom missed having the newborn in her arms. As soon as that kid was up and walking, she needed another baby to feel okay.
Yeah.
I understand. It was a wake-up for me, because I hadn't encountered that in a person before. I'd seen it in the literature, but I'd never seen it in, and it was really a hunger on her part to have that baby. And so, yeah, I did work with her on some of the ways that she didn't have to have it physically, but I don't think they had, I think they went on for number 9 and that was it. They didn't keep on going. So those kinds of, both pieces of that help with, you know, this issue that we're dealing with, help us understand that we can be in sharing communities, and that sometimes that emotional drive is, you know, so intense. And if we can find a way to replace the assumption that it has to be a new baby to have that that drive filled. You were going to say something.
Oh, I was just wanting to point out that there's an empowerment of people going on. It's not just women.
Nice.
Obviously, that has more of an immediate effect, but with the interconnectedness of the world and everyone becoming urbanized, that there's less of that just rote expectation that this is how you do life. You know, you get married, you pop out a couple of kids, and by being more aware of all these different realities, that everyone kind of gets to choose the one that they want at this point. So it's not just women, it's...
There was a point back there where we talked about breaking down traditional roles, assumptions of roles. You know, the number of stay-at-home dads, the number of women in the workplace, the number, you know. And I am aware that, yeah, back in the ghetto days, the Jewish ghetto days, the lady was out there selling and the man was, you know, at home studying. So it wasn't just that she's in the workplace, right? So that's also been, yeah, there are past models that contribute to our understanding as well as current models.
I mean, our acceptance of the LGBT community seems to be part of that, just in the way you were saying, a lot of women are having children so young, you stop and think about it, but also everyone has an opportunity to stop and think about their life choices.
Yes, and that's one of the advantages of urbanization, because you, as crazy as urban life is, so much of your life is already taken care of, is already handled, that you do stop and go, I don't have to do it that way, I could do it this way. And you have access to models of doing it. One of the reasons that the LGBTQ environment or group has grown is because people see it, and now it's okay. It's okay to be, you know, that way. My grandfather married my grandmother so that she would heal him of his homosexuality. And then after they had 3 kids, he ran away to be a homosexual, you know, and to live that life. He chose that life. Never divorced her, but chose that life. But he felt like he had to do both in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah.
He had to do both. Whereas his granddaughter, in college, she met the love of her life, and the 2 women have been together for 40 years now. Right? It's a whole different world, and I love it.
It's also a different world, though, because when I was growing up, you know, gay people didn't have kids. I didn't know anybody who had kids. That was sort of what happened.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all these people are having kids like everybody else. So it has been pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
We know a gay couple that has just had their 2nd child, and she's 49.
Good for
Wow.
them, good for them.
Wow.
One of the guys there was a guy who came to me when his kids were like, 4th, 5th grade, and he's going, how do I keep them from being destroyed by the system? And I've worked with him over the years, and now they're all full adults and all of that. But his daughter met a gal in college, and they're still together 15 years later. And they decided to have a kid. They had his son impregnate the partner, and they're raising his son's kid.
Oh,
So,
that's-
is that fun?
Yeah.
So yeah, there's all kinds of things that we can do that would never have been possibly thought of,
Yeah.
at least out loud in the world. So all of those are contributing, and we're going to see economic disruption because it's happening. So we want to be aware of that. We're going to see more and more nationalization, nationality kinds of things, nation-state issues coming up. What state do you belong to until it dissolves? And I appreciate that you named that. The nation-state idea is not part of the kind of way that humanity is moving forward. When you've got every country a salad bowl, what's the point of having countries, right? The whole world becomes your salad bowl.
Yeah.
And that may be part of what China is counting on, is people from other countries moving in as they become less and less totalitarian.
Well, in Beijing, when I was in Beijing, it was in the early 2000s, and it reminded me of a young lady ready to be courted, and all the young men show up. Because in Beijing, I had every corporation, I met men and women from different corporations from all over the world, all coming to be economically.
Absolutely.
And Beijing was like, come,
Yes.
we want capitalism,
Yes.
invest your money here.
Yes.
And so that, Beijing was becoming
I watched that too from this side. I watched businessmen choosing to go there to get, various things done because it made economic, and it somehow made sense to them in terms of where they thought the world was going. If we have these things done all over the world, that's a better thing than if we have them done just in one spot. So that was an interesting process. So, yeah. Other thoughts on this? Yes, Bert?
There's a show on TV called World of Dance, and they have these dance troupes from all over. And it's so amazing to watch these groups of little kids, bigger kids, and it's kids of all races and sexes, and and they're all like, they're a family. They're like 15, 20 of them. And they're all saying, well, now this our friend here, she has elective mutism, and here's what we're doing for her, or we have this kid here, and his father has never talked to him, and they're all like, they're just taking care, and they're crying, and they're we're here for you. I mean, little kids, we are here for you, and you go, wow, here it comes.
I love it.
It's so exciting.
Yes, it's beautiful.
I know.
Vanessa?
Kind of like what you're talking about in Canada with them, inviting the cream of the crop for immigration. There does seem to be almost a fault tolerance that's trying to be built in, as it becomes a global community, to disperse a population, not all be geographically located in one place. It does almost seem like, building in fault tolerance to,
We have-
a computer system.
Yes, yeah,
That just
right.
naturally kind of.
Not just a safe fail, but not just a fail safe, but a safe fail, right, exactly. We have record number of refugees right now. There have never been as many refugees moving